Good afternoon and welcome. This is William Intriligator, Music Director and Conductor of the Cheyenne Symphony Orchestra. Welcome to our Classic Conversations in preparation for our fantastic finales concert on April 17th. We're very excited about this program. We have the fantastic pianist David Korevaar joining the Symphony Orchestra for Beethoven's 5th Piano Concerto. And we have David Korevaar here. We'll be speaking with him in just a little bit. Before we get to David and talk about the Beethoven Piano Concerto, I'll tell you a little bit about the other two pieces on the program. One of them is a piece you've probably never heard before. The other is a piece that you've heard so many times, hopefully you will hear it with fresh ears. The first I was referring to is the Symphony No. 1 by Joseph Bologna, the Chevalier Saint-Georges. The second is Rossini's famous William Tell Overture. A little bit about the Chevalier Saint-Georges. He's on record as being the first classical composer of African descent. He lived from, the exact dates escape me all of a sudden, the 1740s to like 1799, I believe it was. And this symphony that he wrote, that we'll be performing, was written in 1779. Imagine what was happening in the world at that time. Imagine what was happening on this continent at that time. A brand new country called the United States of America was being formed. This is music from that classical era. Sometimes Saint-Georges was referred to in Paris as the Mozart Noir, the Black Mozart. In actuality, his music is really not very much like Mozart's, and if you had to find a comparison, it might be closer to Haydn. He knew both these gentlemen. He knew Mozart. It's said that he probably was a housemate and shared kind of an apartment with Mozart at one brief time when Mozart was visiting Paris. He also helped commission and conduct the premiere of Haydn's Paris symphonies. So he knew both these masters of the classical style. And what's amazing is that I find the Saint-Georges Symphony No. 1 an example of his own unique voice. It's not imitative of these other masters, it sounds like Saint-Georges. And I think you'll find that as well. Here's a little example of the very opening. Now remember, this is a symphony from the 1770s in Paris where they were expecting the music to have a certain elegance. It was the galant style, maybe suitable for the court of King Louis. Lovely, isn't it? It's just full of energy. It's got a wonderful style. Of course, being written in the 1770s, it wasn't unusual that it's scored for just strings and 2 oboes and 2 French horns. Other members of the modern symphony orchestra were not regular parts of symphonies back then. They hadn't been, either the instruments hadn't been developed enough, or they just hadn't been welcomed into the symphony yet. Of course, with Haydn and Mozart and some of their later pieces, they added flute, clarinet, bassoons, and others. But this is really like a symphony in that early classical style. There is something about the extreme kind of energy of the piece that makes me think of some of Bach's sons, like Carl Philipp Emanuel Bach or Wilhelm Friedemann Bach. And he may have been influenced by them as well. Now, I've only told you part of the incredible story behind this piece, because as wonderful and fresh as this music is, the story of his personal life is unbelievable. You will just not believe it. So, Saint-Georges was born in the West Indies, on an island, where his father was a plantation owner, and his mother was one of the plantation owner's slaves. Rather than not taking the young boy under his wing, he actually really adopted him as a full-fledged son, and at age 8 brought him to Paris so that he could have the finest education in the world. Nothing is really known about his early violin training. In his earlier, teenage years, he was renowned as an athlete, especially as a swordsman. Now, he is on record as, at that time, being probably the best swordsman in all of Europe. It's said that he never really lost any match. There was one time where graciously he let somebody else win. That was the only time, but his amazing skills at the sword were matched with his skills with the violin bow. It's incredible. So he was an amazing virtuoso violinist, as well as composer, as well as swordsman. He was also said to be an incredible marksman. At the time, he got to know John Adams, who was the French ambassador to the US. This was before he was our second president of the United States. And John Adams wrote in his diary that Chevalier Saint-Georges is clearly one of the most impressive men in all of Europe. And with a gun, he can do the most amazing things. He can throw a coin in the air and he will hit it from a distance. Or he will hit any specific button on a coat. So he was writing this in his diary at the time. It's amazing. So just imagine this very handsome, charming, gracious, and very well-mannered young man who is also of African descent in the court of King Louis XV and XVI. He actually became a music teacher for Marie Antoinette for a time. And it is said that she became a real friend and fan of his. She would sometimes show up at his symphony concerts unannounced. He was given the title Chevalier, Knight, by King Louis XV. And in King Louis XVI's era, it was Marie Antoinette who suggested him to be the director of the Paris Opera. It was not, unfortunately, he never got that position because of discrimination, unfortunately. There's so many incredible stories about his life. I'm just giving you a little bit, because when the French Revolution really hit, even though he was so friendly with the aristocracy, he actually fought for the resistance. And he led a battalion of 800 soldiers of African descent, the first French regiment of all African descent. It was called the Regiment Saint-Georges in his honor. There was also a general in that regiment who was the father of Alexandre Dumas, the author of The Three Musketeers. And it's said that Saint-Georges gave Dumas' father a lot of fencing tips and lessons. And perhaps Saint-Georges was the inspiration for the Three Musketeer character of Aramis in Dumas' Three Musketeers. I'm not making this up. This is unbelievable, his story, and I encourage you to check it out more online. There's a wonderful Wikipedia article. But his music is so fresh and wonderful. It's incredible. He wrote operas. He wrote, I think it was about a dozen concertos for violin, several symphonies concertantes, so it's sort of a symphonic concerto, and then the two pure symphonies, one of which you'll hear at the concert with the Cheyenne Symphony. You can tell my enthusiasm for this music and its composer. The final piece on our concert will be Rossini's William Tell Overture, a piece that needs almost no introduction, right? Well, when we think of William Tell Overture, we think, of course, of the finale, the section at the end of the overture that is so well known thanks to the Lone Ranger. Yet we also think of the part right before that, that beautiful pastoral duet, the Ronde des Vaches, the cattle calling song, that has been used also extensively in things like cartoons. And then we remember, oh yes, isn't there a storm? Yes. See, this overture is really a 4-part tone poem. It starts with an incredible musical imagination, if you will. 5 solo cellos, evoking a beautiful, heartfelt song that's said to perhaps represent, in the story of William Tell, the suffering of the Swiss people in the 13th century when they were being ruled by the Austrians and they wanted their independence. And so there's this incredible opening with these solo cellos. And let me just pull that up 1 second here. Oh. All right. What a unique and completely novel way to start a 5-hour opera. One solo cello supported by 4 other solo cellos. One thinks of Rossini as, yes, the greatest Italian opera composer of the early 19th century, pre-Verdi. But mainly people think of him as revolutionizing singing and maybe the opera buffa, comic opera as a whole. But this shows that he also revolutionized the opera orchestra, what it was capable of, the instruments, the sonorities, the imagination. Oh, there's nothing like the cello, right? Interrupted by a slight rumbling in the timpani, a foreshadowing of something that's coming up, the musical storm. I'm very excited to feature our principal cellist, Beth Vanderborg, on this. We heard her play the beautiful Beethoven Triple Concerto as part of the Helios Trio a few months back, and she'll be featured again in this piece. After this section, it leads to the musical storm, and I'll play you a little bit of that. All right. It starts very quietly. A swirling wind in the second violins and violas. Little raindrops in the woodwinds. A little shiver in the first violins. But this will build. And remember, this is Switzerland, so it's one of those mountain storms. Shivering again. Kind of like the weather we've had in Cheyenne this week, actually. We've had some storms. And now the storm is ready to burst. One of the most challenging parts of this is the trombone part, which is actually included on almost every orchestral trombone audition. And they're quite featured in this. The trombones have a huge part to play. There's, of course, a history of musical storms, going back to, Vivaldi or even earlier. But one of the greatest musical storms is, of course, in Beethoven's Pastoral Symphony. So we have a little bit of a tie-in with the Beethoven piano concerto that's on this program. That storm in the Pastoral Symphony has inspired so many other later storms. This one in the Rossini, a storm that's Mendelssohn's Scottish Symphony, the Richard Strauss Heldenleben, so many great musical storms, and this one's up there. Rossini's is up there. Now I'll remind you of the beautiful cattle song that comes after this, after the storm passes. It's sort of like a summer storm where it's gone again and there's a sort of song of thanksgiving like the Beethoven. But in this case, it's two shepherds on separate mountains calling to each other. one an English horn, the other portrayed by the flute. And of course, this is the one I was referring to that's been used in numerous cartoons. But there's also something about this that really resonates, I think, with us here in Wyoming. This is a cattle call song. This is for ranchers, right? There's something sort of like Home on the Range about this, and I think that it will resonate with you. Beautiful music, so great. Now let's remember, we've had 3 sections of this 4-part tone poem overture so far. The beautiful part with the cellos, the musical storm, the cattle call song, Home on the Range, and of course the 4th section, which really needs no introduction at all, does it? Here's a little bit of that. We're just leading into it here. When Rossini wrote this, it was not associated with the Lone Ranger at all. Of course, that came many years later. In the score, he wrote over this section of the score, victory and triumph. And so this represents, going back, if you will, to the heartfelt, kind of emotional outpouring of the cellos. It represents the triumph of the Swiss people over the Austrian oppressors, the tyranny of Austria and the empire. So that's what it meant to him. Rossini's life was equally as colorful as Saint-Georges. They both worked in Paris, by the way. They didn't overlap there at all. But it's important to remember that when Rossini wrote this opera, William Tell, at age 37, he may not have realized that this would be his last opera. He lived another 40 years on a French government pension, enjoying just the wealth of his success. Having worked really hard, he composed, I think, 30 operas in a 10-year span. All 37 of his operas were written from the ages of 17 to, I think, 37. Amazing. So he worked very hard, very quickly. It's said that his famous comic opera, The Barber of Seville, was written in 12 days. And then he just sort of lived off of his success. And it came at just around the right time because, and this ties again into the Beethoven, because Rossini operas, especially the comic operas, were really needed by people at that time because they had been through so long of wars and struggles, Napoleon and the ongoing battles. And so people were ready for something light and funny. They had had enough of political revolutions. In a sense, they had almost had enough of musical revolutions, Beethoven and so forth. So, you know, Beethoven's heyday from like about 1803 to about, I don't know, 1811 or so, yes, that was the time. But then Rossini came in, and it was like a fresh new chapter. And it was nice to kind of smile with the music for a change. But that sense of relief after the war, in a way, is a nice segue into the Beethoven Piano Concerto, which is a piece written in time of war. To tell us a little bit more about that, and to help you really appreciate the performance tomorrow, it's my great pleasure to welcome David Korevaar, our guest artist and wonderful pianist. Welcome, David.
Do it this way.
Right.
Elbow bumps. It's still a little awkward with that even after all this time.
That's right, exactly. We hope to be done with this pretty soon, don't we?
Yeah, well, still gotta be patient here.
Yeah, exactly. I feel so lucky to be able to perform this piece with you, and I love what you're bringing to it. And first, let's start with introducing you to our Cheyenne Symphony audiences and everybody who's watching online. Many probably fans of yours, or even students or former students of yours, might even be tuning into this. But give us a brief, or not so brief. We have time. Tell us a little bit about yourself biographically. Where do you hail from originally?
So I grew up in San Diego, California, and out of high school went to Juilliard.
So you were already a fantastic pianist out of high school.
I don't know about that.
I do.
I was lucky enough, actually, so when I was a teenager, my first piano teacher introduced me to the great American pianist Earl Wild, who was living in Palm Springs at the time. And so I got to study with Earl from the age of 12, I guess.
What an incredible opportunity.
And, and actually he was my main teacher until my early 20s.
Were you one of his only students?
At that time I was. He was basically in kind of he had slowed down quite a bit because of some health issues, and then he actually came back in full strength again a few years after that. But that was a very lucky time because he wasn't actually teaching. He had no institutional affiliation, and then he went back to New York and joined the faculty at Juilliard right around the time I was finishing high school.
Oh, so when you went to Juilliard, you continued studying?
I continued studying with him through my master's. Yeah.
Oh, that's amazing.
And so, having that influence on one hand, and Earl brought an amazing sense of virtuosity, an amazing sense of style, which I think was so important to me in my development. And he also allowed me to be who I was, because our approaches to music are diametrically opposite in many ways.
I was actually kind of thinking that.
Yeah, but he really gave me the tools I needed, I think, to do the things that I could do at the piano, even though I have to say it took me probably 7 or 8 years after I finished studying with him for me to figure out what he told me, which is something I always bear in mind in my own teaching.
You're right.
Because you don't get an instant reaction, right? It takes a long time to process, to absorb, to grow into the things, the tools that you've been given by your teachers.
It's so true. Yeah, I find that as well with my teachers. For many of our listeners and watchers here, viewers, will know the name Earl Wild and his distinctive artistic personality that he had, but many who did not. Maybe you could explain how, in the ways that you might say that your approach to your art and music are a little different, because Earl Wild did have his own unique musical personality, which I think that must have been one of the greatest gifts he gave to you, was to you find yours, which you certainly do.
Right, but it's interesting because, of course, as a kid, I looked up to him so much I wanted to be him.
Yes.
Right? And it takes you a long time. It's these father figure problems we all have, right? And it takes a long time to transcend that and to learn really actually the most important things, which are the tools as opposed to the facts, in a sense. And so he was, of course, somebody who made a big reputation doing a lot of music that might be considered rather flashy. And I think some of a landmark recording of his is Rachmaninoff Concerto Cycle still, and some of his Liszt recordings, which are really phenomenal. And also a lot of his transcriptions. He did some phenomenal transcriptions of Rachmaninoff's songs for solo piano, of Gershwin tunes as piano etudes. He also did a fantastic but enormous fantasy on themes from Porgy and Bess.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yeah, that's fabulous. His association with Gershwin went back to the moment he actually played the Rhapsody in Blue with the Whiteman Orchestra.
Oh my goodness!
And he also played the Rhapsody in Blue with Toscanini.
Oh, that's incredible.
He was the staff pianist or a staff pianist for NBC, and that's actually that was his schooling.
Oh my gosh!
As a young man, he ended up going to New York. I think he never finished his degree at Carnegie Mellon when he was in school. He went to New York and worked at NBC. playing piano and keyboards in the orchestra, but also doing chamber music regularly. We don't think of this today as this incredibly lively broadcasting, but maybe now in the pandemic we should be thinking this way again.
There is a parallel there. Back to the day of radio,
yeah. And just sort of thinking, what an amazing school to grow up in, because he was surrounded by great musicians. He watched Toscanini's conducting. He heard all these performances, and so I feel very privileged to have been kind of a recipient of all of that.
It's incredible. That musical pedigree is your now. Like, it's like he's your musical father, and these others are like musical grandfathers.
Right.
And to start with him at age 12 and continue all the way through your master's degree at Juilliard, what an incredible.
Yeah, and I was lucky enough to continue having a relationship with him after. We weren't in close contact for many years, and then towards the end of his life, he had a record label called Ivory Classics, and asked me to do a number of projects which he produced.
Right.
So to do the recordings, I worked on him, in the production booth. We did a Beethoven Sonata album. We did the Bach Goldberg Variations.
Oh. Was that the one that I remember hearing a beautiful recording of yours with the Ravel Judo? Was that part of that?
I can't record Judo, but I do have a Ravel. I have a Ravel disc that I actually didn't do with Earl. That was one I did. That was one I did a little earlier.
Okay, that's the disc I've heard.
Yeah.
Maybe it didn't have Judo. So.
Yeah, it's all right. It has some good Ravel on it.
Yes.
Sure. Anyway, so that was a wonderful thing to come back to that and sort of reestablish our connection.
What a special ongoing relationship. So then, by way of introducing you, let's talk about how maybe you're not Earl.
Well, right. So, of course, part of it is my repertoire interests. Earl did do a lot of repertoire that we don't associate him with. He has actually a fabulous recording of the Brahms F minor sonata, which isn't terribly well known, but it's really good.
But we think of him more in the flashy record.
Right,
Yeah.
and he also did a superb recording of the 4 Brahms ballades for Vanguard back in the day. I mean, there's some really amazing kind of stuff. Anyway, about me, I guess I should talk about me. I'm now a distinguished professor at the University of Colorado in Boulder. I've been teaching at the University of Colorado since 2000, so I've been in the area for a long time.
Congratulations.
And this is my second appearance with Cheyenne Symphony.
Oh, I didn't realize that.
Yeah, I played Stephen Althoff's last concert.
Oh!
I played the Rachmaninoff Paganini Rhapsody.
Oh, I love that.
So, and somebody with a better sense of the history of the Cheyenne Symphony can tell me what year that was, because frankly, it's all a blur.
I would say it's probably 2007 or
That sounds
8.
about right. Okay.
Yeah, 2007, yeah.
So that was the last time I played the Cheyenne Symphony.
Oh, well, welcome back.
Yeah, and
That's
let's see.
fantastic.
Yeah.
Now, distinguished professor, I'm going to probe a little bit more on that.
Okay.
Because aren't you perhaps the first or even only in the School of Music?
I mentioned the second we've had in the College of Music. My retired colleague, Alan McMurray, who was the longtime director of bands there, was the first. So the University of Colorado has this rank of distinguished professor, which is by nomination. And what's interesting and perhaps not surprising is that a lot of the people who get this distinguished professor recognition are people in the natural sciences or in the sort of biomedical field or engineering. Also a lot of humanists, though. I mean, there's a lot of historians who've gotten this particular honor.
Well, with your probing intellect and your music making, it really fits so wonderfully. I mean,
well, it also puts a certain burden on me to continue to probe, I suppose. I have to remember to continue to be curious.
Well, I was going to say, I mean, that might be one of the ways that you distinguished yourself as different than Earl Wild. Not to say that he wasn't intellectual or had really strong intellectual ideas about music, but I think that's one of the wonderful things that you bring to your music making.
Well, I hope it's well balanced. And I mean, I think that's I look at music making as always dealing with these balances between the analytical and the intuitive that we have to engage in, right? And as performers and communicators, the audience shouldn't be listening and analyzing.
No,
that's not the point.
Yeah.
And when we play, we have to be feeling.
Exactly.
And so this is always it's a challenge to sort of say to people, well, here I can nerd out with the best of you about manuscripts and about structure and about harmony and about
Shakespearean analysis.
I can certainly talk the talk, but in a sense, none of that matters, right? I mean, it all matters, and none of it matters, and it all applies, and
It's
none of it
critically
applies.
important, but you don't want it to be present or really in your face at the performance. And I
Right.
think even Alfred Brendel is on record as saying something along those lines. Who, and of course, he was one of the most kind of
Right.
deep musical thinkers among pianists.
Yeah. So, I mean, we have a long history of that, and I think, but I think it's really important also to remember the idea of style, performance style. I mean, one of the things that fascinates me, being of the generation that we are, and having sort of, I think, grown up in a time when classical music got dried out and homogenized to a great extent, that we're in a kind of stage of correction right now.
Yeah.
And I'm completely fascinated by, late 19th century performance practice. If we think of, the traditions that we inherit as classical musicians when we're engaged in recreation of old music, which is a lot of what we do, it's like this hundreds of years long game of telephone.
I like that. Yeah.
And you think of what happens in a game of telephone,
Oh,
right?
yes.
And how errors creep in.
Yeah, miscommunication.
Right, and maybe they're not errors. Maybe this is just the evolution. I mean,
Right.
who knows? And there has been since the middle of the 20th century a kind of seeking for authenticity. And I'm going to say, first of all, that's a chimera. We can't get to authenticity because we simply don't have. There's no way we're ever going to have the resources to do that. Instead, we can be educated.
Yeah.
But always keeping in mind that performers, until the 20th century, were never slavish followers of dictates.
And
Of any
neither
kind.
did the composers want them to be.
Right, and for the most part, the composers weren't thinking that way. But, there are composers certainly who made something of a fetish of that, including Beethoven.
Right, and
Famously,
others with long written things in their
Right.
music.
There's a great story of Beethoven with his student Ferdinand Ries, where Ries came in and very proudly played the Opus 53 Sonata for Beethoven without the notes, and Beethoven was incredibly offended because he basically said, "There's no way you can have all that detail that's in my score in your head." And it's so funny, here I'm going to play this piece from memory, right? But everybody does it.
Yeah.
Ever since Clara Schumann said we had to do it that way, we went stuck with playing from memory in public. I'm kind of breaking away from that finally, but it's an interesting thing to think about that. And there are certainly, the attitudes change over time. Chopin was actually one who really did want people to follow his scores, interestingly. Liszt, on the other hand, was sort of endlessly creative even with his own music.
Right.
And, the role of spontaneity in performance, is an interesting one.
It is. And in this concerto, specifically the first movement where he warns against a cadenza.
Well, that's right. He says, yeah, don't play a cadenza, play this.
Exactly. He writes it in the score. Don't put a cadenza here, play this.
Right. But what he writes is, in fact, plays exactly the same structural role as a cadenza.
It is. It's essentially
Right.
his written out cadenza.
Yeah, and that's an interesting thing. And what's interesting there, of course, is that he got very close to that already in the fourth concerto, where there are two different cadenzas for the first one that he wrote, but they feel like they're kind of necessary. And there are examples I find in Mozart also where some of Mozart's contributed cadenzas almost feel structurally necessary. The K450 to get really nerdy about it. There's a few where you just feel like those fit so perfectly in the structure.
Think about that one, yeah. Do we have some of his for the D minor as well?
No, Mozart did not write
Okay.
cadenzas for the D minor. It's an interesting whack, actually.
Yeah.
Anyway, that said, there's a couple things about the Emperor Concerto that really stand out. One of them is how it begins. Now, Beethoven, in the fourth concerto, had already defeated all our expectations of a concerto. Right? In the fourth concerto, instead of beginning with a 25-minute long orchestral tutti like the third concerto does, it's not 25 minutes, it just feels that way.
Right, waiting to bring in the soloist,
Right.
like a curtain rising, with
Right.
the introduction of the themes, almost like an overture, which would have been what the audience would have expected.
Right, and generally opening statements in concertos, even if they were soft, tended to have a certain kind of monumentality to them. I mean, think like the third concerto where it begins pianissimo, but still. Right? It is an invitation, but still, there's something about it that's very defined. What's interesting about the fourth concerto to me is actually that not only does the piano begin the piece, but it begins it with ambiguity.
Yes.
Almost like a cadenza. Quite right. And then the orchestra comes in on a totally unexpected chord.
Yeah, it's so great. But now, for the concerto, that
right. So what we're going to do is, of course, something where Beethoven actually, I actually think that there's a Mozart influence here. I think that the K271 Mozart concerto, which is actually it's an early Mozart concerto in which the pianist plays in the second measure of the piece, or the third measure, I guess. You've got this. The orchestra goes. The pianist goes. So this kind of opening gambit where the soloist is actually participating from the beginning already exists.
Okay.
And what Mozart does after that is then write out a full normal first exposition. Right? You would expect after you've had this very brief dialogue. Beethoven does something similar, but instead of just having these rather simple answers, he begins with the orchestra giving us a massive E flat major chord, on the same key as this Mozart concerto, followed by essentially a written out improvisation for the pianist. And it's basically, it's not thematic in any particular way. It's really just about, this is an E flat major chord, and here is how I feel about an E flat major chord.
Yeah, it's just a grand, like, here I am gesture.
Right, and it says, it alters the terms of the drama. So in the fourth concerto, the pianist enters almost apologetically at the beginning, saying, listen, And in the fifth concerto, what happens is Beethoven does this big chord, and then the pianist comes in. And it could have just started there, right?
It could have.
We didn't have to have any of that.
There's something sort of tragic, though, about knowing that the fact that with these three amazing gestures at the piano, it's like he's saying, here I am, but this is the only piano concerto that he never performed in public himself as pianist. So there's something kind of sad about that. And he put himself on the page, but he wasn't able to play it because of his deafness.
Right. Yes, he did play the premiere of the Choral Fantasy still.
That's true. He wasn't. It's not like he was completely done.
And he did the premiere of the Archduke Trio, which was apparently something of a train wreck. But
so let's talk about the Archduke, because when we did the triple concerto back in January, we talked about Archduke Rudolph.
He's a rather important character in this drama.
Very important in this piece.
He premiered it.
He premiered it. Now, wait, you say he premiered this?
He did.
I thought, William, you told us back in January that he might not have been the greatest pianist, and that might be why the piano part of the triple concerto is not as demanding as the violin and cello parts. But here we are, where he dedicated this piece to him, and Rudolph performed the first performance.
Yeah.
So he must have been quite
He must have been pretty good. And I'm assuming that the Archduke Trio is actually technically one of the most formidable pieces of chamber music Beethoven ever
It's
wrote.
such a great piece.
It's really hard.
Yes.
And just sort of thinking about that and the technical demands.
Yeah, that's true.
I think Rudolph was not only a patron of Beethoven's, which he certainly was, but he was clearly a friend.
Yes.
And Beethoven, right, the student slash,
Right.
more on the collegial side of being a student in a sense,
Yes.
I think. And I think that's important. This piece again was written for him and dedicated to him, as many of Beethoven's works were.
Right. And Rudolph was one of the group of three that kept Beethoven in Vienna by promising him an annual stipend.
Right.
And so, Prince Lichnowsky and the other.
What was the other one? Don't ask me.
No.
You're not supposed to put me on the spot with it.
No, it's the Lubowitz.
That sounds right.
Yeah.
So Lobkowitz.
That's it, Lobkowitz. Thank you. So the three of them.
This piece was premiered at Lobkowitz's palace.
That's right, it was. That was the first performance was a private performance
Right.
at the palace. Yeah. So anyway, these three guys, fearing that Beethoven was going to accept an offer to move, I can't remember where. Might have even been Berlin, but they said no, you have to stay in Vienna, and so they promised him this money every year, and so yeah, it was a very strong relationship between Beethoven and these archduke. So we have these incredible gestures, and then the orchestra begins, and then the pianist gets to sit there for, what would you say, it is about 4 minutes?
It feels like about 20 minutes
It
actually in
feels
context
so long.
because you've just warmed up, right?
Yes.
It's interesting because Brahms in his second concerto basically repeats this same gambit.
Yes.
And in that case, that exposition is significantly shorter.
Right.
I think that's only about 2.5 or 3 minutes of music.
Right.
And it's an interesting thing. That's also a hard one to sit through because that piece is just so formidable.
Well, I feel like this exposition isn't hard to sit through at all, though. I mean,
No, it isn't. But
it's
I think
amazing what Beethoven can do.
Right.
Okay, we have to warn you that this piano concerto is one of the longest.
Right, it's a symphony.
It's a symphony.
The first movement takes 25 minutes? It's around
Right.
that.
The entire Saint-Georges symphony that's on the same program is about 12 minutes. The first movement of this concerto is what? 25 minutes.
I mean, the violin concerto is like this too.
Yes.
Right? I mean, this is Beethoven has kind of steroided up the concerto to this place.
He absolutely has. Yeah, the
movements
violin
are
concerto is very
massive.
similar. So you get to settle in. The orchestra's going to present the themes without the soloist after that grand introduction.
Right.
And then the soloist gets to just wait and think about those and then comes in with, again, a kind of a surprise.
Right. Well, this is interesting because Beethoven inherits the concerto from Mozart, who really is the father of the piano concerto
Yes.
in every possible way. And there's various ways of dealing with the soloist entrance, right? The soloist can just come in and play the first theme, as sometimes happens. And Beethoven uses that in his third concerto. Or the soloist can come in with a kind of an improvisation, what we call an Eingang, which is basically a preparation for the return of the theme. Beethoven does that in his first two concertos, actually, where the pianist comes in with just sort of a quiet improvisation, actually. In this one, I feel like he kind of combines those two ideas, and where the orchestra presents the theme in a very sort of martial, energetic way. With all these march rhythms and these very enthusiastic 16th notes. Strings. Yeah. He takes that march rhythm, and that becomes the invitation for the soloist, which is and then the winds play softly. And that ninth, I love that.
Yeah, the ninth is amazing.
And then the pianist comes in just playing a chromatic scale, which is kind of child's play for pianists, so we know how to do those. And the long trills, the orchestra plays a series of chords. And then I play what? I play a chord, and then I think, well, they've been playing for a while, what am I going to do now? And there's another, I'm going to play a kind of introverted, lyrical version of this martial theme. And then I'm going to come to a 6/4 chord, which is an invitation for a cadenza. classical concerto sort of syntax, we get to that chord, we know, time to improvise.
Yes.
That's what this means. And so he writes for me this improvisation, etc. And then the orchestra then, at a certain point, is brought back in. And it's such a marvelous kind of way of creating this really important transition.
It is, and it also sets up a kind of drama and a kind of trope that is foreshadowing the second movement too. The idea of the soloist can come in and be a dreamer on what has just happened, but then go a little bit crazy, but still be a dreamer, a kind of improviser on the orchestra's rigidity, if you will. So that we're going to more about that later.
I think
more about that later.
I think that's a reasonable. That's actually not a bad segue, but we could say it. I guess in terms of the first movement, the other thing to think about is the way those three opening chords that have the cadenzas, how he keeps bringing that back to, and sort of the rhetoric of that at sort of critical structural moments in the piece, we do get these moments.
Yeah.
Well, and there's a lot in the middle of the development, where dum da dum dum da dum dum da, this big A flat chord.
Yes, exactly. He's announcing the important areas of the piece.
Or the C flat major chord.
The C flat is going to be announcing the slow movement. Exactly.
Yeah.
By the way, those are the opening chords. Yes, those are the same chords that you learn in a rock band. The 1, 4, 5. Yes, Beethoven did it. He gave us the example. That was the opening of the Emperor Concerto in a nutshell. Yes, thank you.
Of course, that's all classical music in a nutshell, isn't it?
Well, I mean, maybe, yes.
And Beethoven often evades that 4 chord, the A flat chord. He often just skips. Right. He likes just 1 and 5. So.
Right, or throw a German, I've got a sixth in there and go to someplace else.
Right. Could happen.
So then, okay, let's talk about the slow movement. It is so special, isn't it? Among everything that he wrote, it has a special place, I think, in a lot of people's hearts.
One thing that I'm endlessly fascinated is by the sense that composers have of different keys and of key relations. And I think that's really important here. You mentioned that C flat chord, but of course, backtracking a little to the first movement, when the pianist plays the second theme in the solo exposition, it's first presented in the key of B minor. Now, the orchestra had played it in E flat minor in the first exposition. But this is an amazing thing, is that somehow or another from this original key, E flat, we end up here.
So different, right? Yes.
Right. And the way we get there is through this one note, the G flat, which becomes the 5 of this. But it's a really remarkable moment when I'm sitting here playing the second theme. In that way.
He's setting up what's going to be the key of the slow movement.
Right. And that's kind of the first sort of premonition. And then we go to C flat, right? A variation of that theme. So thinking about that color. And then we finish the first movement with these E flat chords, and then we start here.
It's like a new world.
Right. Yes. And of course, the commonality is this melody note, which was our own.
A few years later, Schubert would do the same thing, and even though in a way he was rejecting some of Beethoven's style in his Fifth Symphony that's in B flat, there's a lot of E flat in the slow movement. It's in E flat, and then it has a ton of C flat. Yes, it's similar. Now I do have queued up about that orchestral interruption, just a little bit, so you can hear that how gorgeous this is. And some of you might recognize this. It was used in the King's Speech in a glorious way. Remember that? Here it is. Sorry. a beautiful foil to the incredible intensity of the other movements. The first movement and that martial quality, it has that opposite. It's like a hymn. It's a love song. What is it? I mean, we don't know. It's an elegy.
But it still has, especially because of the pizzicato, it still has a kind of processional quality.
It does. It is sort of marching style. You're right. Which informs the tempo. We've had a lot of conversations about the tempo. Yes.
Well, it's interesting too. I mean, the strings are muted at the beginning, which is another interesting textural choice. It's quite unusual for the period.
Yeah, just the violins are muted. So the violas, there's no mute. And the pizzicato, cellos, and basses also not muted.
Right.
So, but that is another way that he changes the color. There's a certain kind of already kind of muted quality to C flat major or B major, which this piece is in. And then he brings down the brightness even more with the violin mutes. Thank you for mentioning that. So then we have the first piano entrance, and that brings us to that dreamy kind of.
Right.
Do you want to show us?
I sure love that. Yeah, it's fascinating to me because initially what I'm doing seems to have very little to do with what the orchestra has done. It's more like at the beginning of the concerto where you gave me a chord and I played, and this is sort of the same thing. You set B major, and so I come in B major and start playing scales.
Makes you want to cry. It's so gorgeous.
And it's just my comment on the key in a sense. I mean, with these little flashes of reminiscences of what the orchestra's done.
I see what you're saying. It's like that opening flourishes of the first movement. It's a comment on this is what this key, how I feel about it.
That's right. And then then he simply moves it to D major, and I do it again, and it comes out different from the same starting place. It's a really interesting kind of thing in the sense of the difference, and I think that's interesting to hear. The orchestra provides a transition, but if I just play my opening in B major, and I play this opening in D major, right away your heart beats at a different rate. It's an amazing thing. And of course, because those keys are a minor third apart, it's a very startling kind of change. It's not what we expect.
Yeah. Well, he's also setting up this idea that we're going to move keys by these third relations.
Right.
So then when we get to the end of this movement, we're going to surprise us again with a half step.
Yes.
So that maybe ahead of myself.
You are indeed.
So yeah, the D major has almost like new hope or a new feeling of brightness.
Right. Exactly.
Let's tell them about what was going on with the French troops at the time. So Beethoven at the time, he never settled in one apartment in Vienna. Partially he was kicked out of almost every place he lived in. But at the time he was living in a place that was like literally right on the ramparts, the wall protecting Vienna from the French troops. And the French troops were literally shooting cannons at that wall. So Beethoven hid in the basement and put pillows over his ears to try to protect what little was left of his hearing. And it was like rumbling through him constantly, and he hated it. So then he took off and he fled to his brother's house that was farther away from the action. But you have this sense of this music, and especially in the outer movements, there's this martial quality to dum da dum or bum ba da bum ba da bum ba da in the last movement. And so here is a moment of tender reflection and peace. Finally, peace. in the second one.
And he keeps it for the whole movement, which is
Yeah.
one of the most amazing things. It's one of the longest sustained expressions of that kind of character.
That's so
I think
true.
that Beethoven.
Yeah.
You know, maybe in some of the late quartets he gets to that again. But
That's right.
It's really.
It also makes me think that sometimes Beethoven, with all of his complexity and all of his depth, sometimes it's his most simple music that strikes us the deepest, you know, and is the most profound, such as the scales that you call simple scales, or like the Ode to Joy, or some of his pieces that are the almost like bare bones of music. That is where he finds the most incredible poetry.
Right.
Yeah, and you're playing it so beautifully.
Well, thank you. Yeah, I was playing that, and just there's so many things to unpack about his use of triplets and 16th notes in this movement, which is kind of a sub-theme somewhere in there. The relationships, because he goes into this 3 against 4 at a slow speed, which is quite difficult to do. This is one of these sort of acts of rhythmic wheel played on these polyrhythms slowly.
Right.
And I don't know if you've heard that at the end of this first solo, but it's like we've done everything has been triplets, and then right at the end, there's 2 beats of 16th notes. And it's a remarkable change in the spirit of the music.
It
somehow.
is. But it also shows that it's like this voice on top just can't be confined.
Mhm.
You know, there's a sense of searching for freedom, or defiantly expressing one's freedom.
Well, and when we come together at the end, when the orchestra plays the theme the last time, and the piano plays the 16th note, doubling of the theme essentially.
Yeah.
You know, there's a kind of sense of resolution of things that have been set up.
That's so
through
true.
the whole piece, and the triplets are completely gone by then. There's been this kind of battle between. I mean, it's a very quiet.
That's a great
Struggle
struggle. I
between
never
the
thought about that.
16th through the
By the
whole
end of the
movement.
movement, the 16ths have won out.
Yeah.
I never thought of it that way. That's brilliant.
And the 16ths are calm. It's funny. They're
Yes.
a faster moving note, but they're calmer than the triplets. Almost.
Yes, they
It's
feel more
calm.
settled in.
Yeah.
And if the audience is feeling like, why are the woodwinds playing so much? The piano is the solo. Well, yes, but the pianist is oftentimes in an accompanying role here.
Yeah.
And you said that you have the melody in your notes.
I actually have I have the whole tune. It's a wonderful kind of, I think, unison passage in a sense.
It is. Yeah.
It's
like
almost
your arabesquing
Yeah.
with the woodwinds,
Yeah.
or gossamer kind of thing. Yeah.
Yeah.
Fascinating. How are we on time?
We're about out. I think.
Almost out of time.
Yeah.
One of the most amazing things about this concerto we haven't talked about is the transition from the second movement to the third movement, which goes without a break. So you'll have a final resolution and calmness on this B that has been our, B major, our home note of this slow movement.
It's just left just holding it.
Just two bassoons and horn.
And then it moves. Now
It moves down a half step, contradicting what we might expect with these thirds that we've been having. And that brings us to the dominant of the home key of E flat of the outer movement.
The pianist improvises something. Another great transition. Anyway, and then I play one last note. And then, I don't know if we should give it away or not. People have to come to concert.
Oh,
Yeah, and we'll stop on the dominant set. Then they have to come to the concert because they can't
Exactly.
sleep tonight.
And near the end of this wonderful third movement, this rondo, kind of sonata rondo, which has, this German dance quality with these offbeat hemiolas. Near the end, he brings back this hint of the distant cannons. And in a way, it ties in with the William Tell Overture, with the rumbling of the timpani announcing the storm that's coming. So we have an incredible duet that had never been anything like this written before between the solo piano and the timpani drums in the back of the orchestra playing together. So the drums have this rhythm that's, perhaps a distant canon, or a distant kind of, the armies have left. And it almost seems as though the concerto is going to wind down and end quietly, doesn't it? But then there's another surprise.
Yeah, we finished one.
Yes.
Yeah, I finished the big ending. What was that? What was that movie? Network News, where they had this
Big ending.
We needed the theme music. I had a big ending.
Yes. You know what we forgot to mention was the connection with West Side Story. We
Well,
talked about that beforehand. The slow movement has that, which undoubtedly inspired Bernstein in the Somewhere theme from West Side Story. It's another nice little connection. David, it's been such a pleasure visiting with you, getting to know you, getting to know your ideas of the Beethoven Concerto. You're brilliant both in your virtuosity and your musical poetry, as well as your intellect. The heart and the mind in perfect balance.
So you're flattering me. Anyway,
Well, it's all true.
it's going to be great fun collaborating. I'm really looking forward to this.
Me too. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
David Korevaar, our wonderful guest artist, our pianist for the Beethoven Piano Concerto No. 5. I did want to mention that this weekend's concert is not the last concert of our season. It's the last masterpiece program, but we have a performance on June 12th of Raiders of the Lost Ark live in concert. Remember, this is the full movie on a huge screen with a huge orchestra playing the soundtrack live. June 12th. You won't want to miss that. That's a first for Cheyenne. And then the next evening, on Sunday night, June 13th, at 7 p.m., we present a free concert at Lions Park entitled Symphony at Sunset. And it'll include many audience favorites, soundtrack themes, light classics, the 1812 Overture, many other wonderful pieces. So we encourage you to join us for those events. And to tell us a little bit more about what might be happening here at the Laramie County Library, as we've done before, I want to thank our hosts, the Laramie County Library, for hosting this all season long. And I want to introduce Elizabeth Thorson, who will tell you about some of the other programs they have. Thank you.
Thank you. We're so glad that you were able to join us today. This is not the last event of the symphony season, as William just explained, but it is the last event for our classic conversations for the season. We do hope that in the fall we will be able to do in-person and live streaming. So watch your library information and the news to see if we're able to pull that off in the fall. We have a lot of events coming up in May and June for you. Our biggest one will be the Summer Reading Challenge. We've renamed it. And that does include adults, and we have some fabulous prizes for you. So please come to the library or check online to see what we have in store for you.
Isn't that a great way to encourage kids to read during the summer?
Yes, we've had amazing success with kids, teens, and adults, and it really helps when they can read together.
We partnered with you a few years back about picking some books that had musical connections too. I remember that.
Yes.
What else is going on?
Well, we have the Wyoming Reads program for the first graders in the county. We won't be able to do our usual program of an event at the Civic Center and an event, story time here at the library this year, but the kids will still get their books. We have all sorts of fun adventures for kids in the summer with our Summer Reading Challenge theme, which is the impossible, so they're all animal-themed events. And then for the adults, we have some L2B, our Library to Business programs. We have Jeopardy. We have information coming out in this month for Money Smart month. So those are the next couple of weeks. We have our usual genealogy classes. We have all sorts of things happening. Oh, and the Seed Library. We just launched our 5th year of our Seed Library. We have 158 seeds available. We are running out of some because quantities are limited on some of the varieties. So we suggest that people either come into the library or use our online form on our website to select your seeds.
That's so fantastic. Free seeds.
Free
what
seeds.
A great thing.
And they're all suitable for Wyoming.
Yes.
Yes.
You know, and if I may just borrow the mic one more time, if they wanted to know more about these programs, can they go to your website?
Yes.
What is that?
Yes, the library's website is laramiecountylibrary.org. There's an event calendar, which I believe is linked on the right side. There's also a link to all of our services, which are not necessarily events, but more like ongoing programs.
Sure. Yeah. And then I also wanted to mention David Korevaar has a fantastic website with links to some of his online performances. And David, you were telling me you have a performance coming up a week from Sunday, I think it is?
A week from Sunday, yeah.
Tell us about that. Oh, you're
I'm still liked, I guess.
Yeah.
It's a week from Sunday, and it's sponsored by the Connecticut Chopin Society. It looks like it's not even a paid event, it's just a registered Zoom.
So you can just Google, was it Connecticut Chopin Society?
I think that works.
And just sign up for a live stream of his Chopin recital that's come up next, not this coming week, but the weekend after.
Let me just pull it up. It's Chopin Society, yeah, it's one word, chopinsocietyct.org.
For Connecticut.
Yeah, and then my picture and the link is right there at the top of their homepage right now. And that's next Sunday. It'll be live at 2 p.m. Mountain Time, I believe.
Okay.
4 p.m. Eastern.
Great.
Yeah.
We're excited.
I'm looking forward to that. And then I also, my website, davidkorevaar.com, there's links to my YouTube page. We were talking earlier about the fact that I had a COVID project, which was to do all of the Beethoven sonatas in my living room using a USB mic. Pretty minimal setup, and no piano tuning, which created its own special ambience. It's a whole different world of authenticity.
I'd love to hear that. All 32 Beethoven piano sonatas that you did in what was the how many days?
I did it very quick. I did it very fast, and then I ended up continuing the project actually through the summer. I finished with the Diabelli variations in August.
Oh my goodness! Wow. So. Fantastic. Thank you, David. Thank you, Elizabeth. Anything else you wanted to share with us?
No, that's it. But please keep an eye on our website, the Symphony's website,
Yep.
and it sounds like David's website has quite a lot of activity on it too.
Yep.
We hope to see you again soon. Thank you.